Arts, Quarter 1, Module 2. Distinct characteristics of art sculptures from Western classical art traditions. Sculpture is the art of making two- or three-dimensional representative or abstract forms, especially by carving stone or wood or by casting metal or plaster. Sculpture is created through three basic processes: carving, modeling, or assembly. Generally, materials such as a block of wood, stone, and other hard materials are used. Like painting, Western sculpture has tended to be humanistic and naturalistic, concentrating upon the human figure and human action studied from nature. Prehistoric sculptures. Materials used in sculptures varies according to region and locality. Archaeologists believe that their sculpture is a result of natural erosion and not of human artistry. Frequently, carving may have mythological or religious significance. Characteristics of the sculptures. The sculpture was portable and small. Images of humans, particularly the women, have enlarged sexual organs and small feet and arms. Carving on cave walls used the natural modulation in the wall surface to enhance the image. Venus of Willendorf, found on August 7, 1908 by a workman named Joseph Sambati in Willendorf, Lower Austria. Carved from limestone, showing heavy breasts and large abdomen, believed to be a charm to ensure fertility.
Archaeologists who have looked at this carefully have suggested that perhaps the exaggeration of the stomach and of the breasts and of the head, the sort of bulbous shapes throughout, are partially a result of the natural shape of the stone. This is a limestone object. She's symmetrical and is clearly not something that was meant to stand up. As you mentioned, there were no feet, but this is a figure that would easily fill a hand, and you have the sense that this is something that was meant to be held.
Carried in a pocket, perhaps, something like that. She does fit comfortably in a hand. We know that she was originally painted with ochre paint, a kind of red paint. Beyond that, it's really hard to say much more.
So,
Venus of Brasimpouy, discovered in a cave at Brasimpouy, France in 1892. A sculpture carved from a mammoth ivory that showed a lady with a hood which represents the human face and hairstyle.
Neolithic. It was discovered in a cave at Brasimpouy, France in 1892. About 25,000 years old, it is one of the earliest known realistic representations of a human face. Brasimpouy is a small village in the department of Landes in southwest France. Two caves near the village, 100 meters from each other, were among the first Paleolithic sites to be explored in France. They are known as the Galerie des Hyènes and the Grotte du Pape. The Venus of Brasimpouy was discovered in the Pope's Cave in 1894, accompanied by at least 8 other human figures. These may be an example of unfinished work, as if the artist or artists carved several figurines at the same time. P. Dubelin first explored the Grotte du Pape in 1881, followed by J. de la Porterie and Edouard Piet from 1894 onwards. Since archaeological excavation techniques were then only starting to develop, they paid little attention to the stratigraphy of the site containing the remains.
Egyptian sculptures. Symbolic elements such as forms, hieroglyphics, relative size, location, materials, color, actions, and gestures were widely used. Their tombs required the most extensive use of sculpture. The most materials used for sculptures are wood, ivory, and stones. Characteristics of the sculptures. Symbolisms were heavily used to represent the gods. They were represented as composite creatures with animal heads on human bodies. Relief compositions were arranged in horizontal lines to record an event or to represent an action. Most of the time, the gods were shown larger than their followers, the dead larger than the living. Empty spaces were filled with figures or hieroglyphics. All individual components were all brought to the plane of representation and laid out like writing. Queen Nefertiti bust, created in 1345 BC by Thutmose in ancient Egypt and was discovered in Amarna on December 6, 1912 by German Oriental Society. A painted stucco-coated limestone bust of the great royal wife of Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten, and the most copied works of ancient Egypt.
Berlin, and we're looking at the famous bust of Nefertiti. It is a life-size, full-color image, and it's really impressive.
It's the treasure of this museum, and it's been placed in a rotunda with a large dome. She's been placed slightly higher than eye level, so we look up at her. She's fabulously beautiful.
She's virtually the sole work of art in this very large space. Clearly, she is the focal point.
Yeah, it's quite theatrical. And unlike so many other Egyptian sculptures, she wasn't intended for a tomb. She was found in the studio of the artist who made her, Thutmose.
We think that this sculpture was actually a model that he had created in order to work on other sculptures of her. That is, this sculpture would function really as a three-dimensional sketch.
As a prototype.
That's right. And there are a few reasons why that's thought. Not only was it found in his studio, but it is incomplete in a way that suggests that it was never meant to be completed. If you look, for instance, at the sockets of the eyes, that would generally be inlaid with semi-precious stones, but only one eye has any inlay in it, and in that case, it's temporary material, even wax, and so not the kind of quality one would expect in a full-fledged sculpture for the queen.
Art historians have discovered through scientific analysis that she's made not just of painted limestone, but limestone that's been covered with a very, very thin layer of plaster, and that enabled the sculptor to achieve really subtle effects modeling her face.
But in the neck and headdress, plaster gets much thicker, and it would have been much easier to work and create that very fine detail on the plaster rather than the coarser material of the limestone core.
And that's so important where we see the lines, the very subtle movement around her cheeks. What's so remarkable about this sculpture is how sensitively carved she is, how we really get a sense of skin and bone and these lovely movements around her face.
She's tremendously elegant, but even beyond the simple elegance of the contours of her face, her high cheekbones, the shallow of her cheeks,
Her long neck.
beautiful symmetry, a way in which line is unified throughout the entire portrait bust. For instance, follow the lines downward that are constructed by the contours of her headdress. It tapers as it moves towards her chin, so her face and headdress create a perfect triangle. But that's actually continued by the lines of her neck below her chin, and it's accentuated by the lighting in this museum. But it really does create the sense of continuity from the top of the sculpture to its base.
What we're describing is a new ideal of beauty that's really different from the tradition of ancient Egyptian sculpture, and that's because Nefertiti was the wife of the pharaoh Akhenaten, who established a new religion in ancient Egypt, which was monotheistic instead of the traditional polytheistic religion, and with that he created a new ideal of beauty that we see in the sculptures that were created during his reign.
That's right. I think we see this sculpture really as a perfect exemplar. Nefertiti is especially interesting because we believe she did not simply function as the wife of the pharaoh. She is shown in so many portraits with the accoutrements of the ruler that we think that she actually shared power.
It's interesting, this period that we call the Amarna period of Akhenaten's reign, where we have two powerful women, his mother Tiye and his wife Nefertiti.
Both represented as beautiful women, as powerful women, and giving us a kind of insight into late Egyptian culture.
Statue of Pharaoh Menkaure and his queen, discovered by George Reisner on January 18, 1910. Carved in a smooth-grained dark stone called greywalk or schist that created a sense of eternity and immortality. Greek sculptures. Early Greek sculptures were tensed and stiff. Their bodies were hidden within enfolding robes. After 3 centuries of experiments, Greek sculptures had finally evolved and showed all the points of human anatomy and proportion. One of the most popular styles of the Greek sculptures was the Hellenistic style. Characteristics of the sculptures. Hellenistic denotes a preference in sculpture for more elaborated patterns, mannered arrangement of figures and groups, and an emphasis on the representation of movement for dramatic effects. Human being as the depiction of physical beauty and spiritual equilibrium. sculpture was composed almost entirely of marble or bronze. Human beauty was the canon, and naked human body is the main subject. Greeks built life-size statues, primarily male, nude, well-muscled, anonymous, and blank-faced. The Discobolus, created on 460 to 450 BC by Myron of Eleutherate, an Athenian sculptor known for his bronze artworks of athletes, figuring a youthful ancient Greek athlete showing a discus in which original sculpture was made of bronze was lost. Some copies were made out of marble and smaller replicas were made of bronze.
Or marble are frozen, but that doesn't mean that the ancient Greeks didn't want to convey movement.
In this case, movement that you couldn't even see with the naked eye.
What we're looking at is a sculpture by an artist whose name is Myron. We've lost his original, but we have a later Roman marble copy of the discus thrower.
The original was in bronze from the 5th century BCE.
About 450, 460.
And what we're looking at is one of many Roman copies. In fact, there's one next to the other in this museum, a testament to how popular these were among the Romans.
The sculpture shows a man who is at that moment where his body is fully wound. Look at the way that his right leg is bearing the weight of his body. His left leg, the toes are bent under, dragging slightly, and he's about to throw that discus. There's this moment of a tremendous tension, but it's also this moment of stasis, stillness, right before the action.
Athletes and art historians have debated whether this is even an actual pose that the discus thrower takes in the process.
It's so interesting because when we think back about the history of the Greek figure, we think first of the archaic Koros, who is so stiff and so stylized, and then we have the tremendous breakthroughs of people like Polykleitos, who develop an understanding of the body and show it in contrapposto. But here we have something that's so dynamic and so complex. And just look at the arc of the shoulders and the arms and the way that they reverse the arc of the twist of the hips.
That is the overriding concern of Myron, the sculptor, to capture the aesthetic qualities here, the sense of balance and harmony and the beauty in the proportions of the body.
Roman sculpture. In addition to mythological works, the Romans produced a great volume of civic sculptures celebrating statesmen and their achievements. The Roman basque sculpture or portraiture is the most dominant genre. Characteristics of the sculptures. Sculpture is an evolution from naturalism to realism, showing the wrinkles, the bulges, and aging, which aim at glorifying authorities. The monumental altars, commemorative columns, and triumphal arches were excellent surfaces for decorative reliefs of the typical narrative style. Romans worked stone, precious metals, glass, and terracotta, but favored bronze and marble above all else for their finest work. The Porto Nacio sarcophagus, carved in marble and used for the burial of Roman general involved in the campaign of Marcus Aurelius, which depicts battle scenes between Romans and Germans. Byzantine sculptures. The Byzantine sculpture in the early days is more an extension of the Hellenistic art, where portraits of great impacting aesthetics drama were produced. Sculpture relief was used to adorn magnificent palaces and churches. It is the richest expression of Christian dogma. Characteristics of the sculptures. Sculpture was often done in ivory or precious metals. Used the triptych frequently, a three-paneled sculpture or painting. Known for its mosaics, a decoration using pieces of stone, marble, or colored glass that are cemented to wall or floor into a picture. The dominant features are religious, everyday life scenes, and motifs from nature. Animals were used as symbols, like dove, deer, or peafowl, while some had acrostic signs that contained a great theological significance. The Barberini Diptych, Louvre Museum. It represents the Emperor Justinian I as triumphant victor, which consisted of 5 ivory plaques fitted together.
An emperor on horseback in the central panel with 4 panels on the 4 sides, one of which is lost.
What's remarkable to me is just how deeply carved and how energized the central panel is. And there's been tremendous care in representing not only fine details, but also alternations between areas of deep carving and broad, smooth areas, for instance, of the horse's body. This is so clearly an illustration of this moment of transition between the classical tradition and the Byzantine as we will come to know it.
Romanesque sculptures. Some of famous sculptural pieces are reliquaries, altar frontals, crucifixes, and the devotional images. Small individual works of art were generally made of costly materials for royal and aristocratic patrons. These lightweight devotional images were usually carried during processions, both inside and outside the churches. Characteristics of the sculptures. They were not realistic. Unrealistic human figures. The human figures may be elongated or squat and dumpy. They were painted in bright colors to attract the attention of the people. The sculptures were adapted to fit into space available in capitals and cloisters. Subject matter overwhelmingly religious. Last Judgment, carved by Gislibertus before 1135 in Cathedral of Saint Lazare in Autun, France. Displayed in the tympanum covered with plaster, and its center Christ is enthroned in a gloriole held by angels.
Medieval mind.
We're looking up at the doorway of the Cathedral of Autun, which represents, I think, the most terrifying image of the Last Judgment, of the damned in hell that exists in art history.
Of course, it also includes heaven, but I think people were probably spending much more time looking and fearing hell. This is a sculpture that is one of the first monumental sculptures.
Gothic sculptures. Gothic sculptures have a greater freedom of style. They no longer lay closely against the wall, but began to project outward. Figures were given their own particular attitudes instead of being set into particular patterns, and are more lively and realistic. Characteristics of the sculptures. Sepulchres are one of the new locations for sculpture wherein a death is depicted by a person on the bed, laying or praying. Approximation to physical beauty from spiritual dimension of their iconography. Characters, gestures, and attitudes are human, and it represents emotions and natural features. It is inspired in the nature with sensitive forms that can be easily understood. Gothic church has 1 compartment, pointed arches, and large windows. Resurrection of the Virgin. End of the 12th century. A group of angels attend the resurrection of the Virgin, supporting her on her emergence from the tomb, that her soul was received by Christ upon her death, though sadly broken in parts, and yet fairly complete as a whole. Pulpit of Pisa Cathedral. sculpted between 1301 and 1310 by Giovanni Pisano. One of the most iconographically dense works of art in the history of art in Italy, crowded with figures from the Old and New Testaments.
This is one of them. This is the pulpit from the Church of Sant'Andrea in Pistoia, which is dated to 1301. This is by Giovanni Pisano. And you can see the structure is essentially the same. There's colored marble columns with capitals, allegorical figures on top of the capitals, below reliefs that make up the low walls of the pulpit itself. One difference you can see right away is that the corners that separate the reliefs are no longer small columns, but rather figures. And what this does is give a greater sense of continuity and connection between the individual reliefs, as opposed to them being very distinctly separated by the frames that we saw in his father's example from 40 years before.
Where there were attached columns there, right?
Right. And I want to look at one specific thing in this pulpit, which is the relief that we see here on top of the Massacre of the Innocents. This tells a story from the New Testament where Herod orders that all the newly born male children in Bethlehem be executed because he's heard that Christ has been born and this new leader that's going to bring great changes that he doesn't want, according to the text. And so he orders this execution, and what we are looking at here is this really emotional, disturbing scene of Roman soldiers slaughtering children and their mothers trying to, as we see here, protect them or mourning over their dead bodies. We see averting their eyes, running away, soldiers with knives in their hands, actually executing infants, the women covering their faces. Here's Herod giving the order. Now, in some ways, Giovanni Pisano's sculpture is connected to that of his father. There's this naturalism that we saw developing earlier on. There's classicism, especially in some of the other areas of the pulpit. But what makes Giovanni Pisano's sculpture of the early 1300s more distinct is obviously his great interest in communicating emotions, a kind of vibrant, expressionistic representation of the feelings, and this that communicates the horrifying scene that we're looking at. It really connects with the viewer and helps.
Their gestures, their facial expressions.
Exactly, those are the keys for him and other artists throughout this period, using gestures and facial expressions to tell a story as powerfully as possible.
And of course, this is another sign of moving away from the Middle Ages, from those Gothic, expressionless faces.
Especially in terms of marrying that kind of those kinds of expressions, that kind of emotion, with naturalism.
Right.
Because sometimes in Gothic art you do see things that are very graphic or violent looking, but also very stylized. And here we have a kind of naturalistic representation that's naturalistic in terms of the physical appearance, and also naturalistic in terms of the psychological expressiveness. And what's interesting